We're off on the road to Rhode Island. We're having the...
Humorist Dave Barry once wrote that he thought the states' names were decreed by the Bible or something, or that they were actually physically written on the continent in gigantic letters the way they are on maps. Well, if that's the case, we're going to need a huge bottle of whiteout, because in the 2020 election, our smallest state, which used to have the biggest name, changed it.
America's just weird. Because I didn't even know that Rhode Island's official full name was Rhode Island and Providence Plantations.
And Trevor Noah's right. America is weird. A lot of people didn't know that Rhode Island's official name is, or was, Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole history of the name, but if you're interested, you can check out my website, and I'll post that link below. But I am going to hit some of the state's historical high points, because it's relevant to the debate surrounding the name change. Rhode Island was founded by one Roger Williams, a Puritan minister who was kicked out of Salem and Boston and Plymouth and, the whole Massachusetts Bay Colony, for his heretical ideas like, how about we pay the natives for some of the land we're gobbling up? And what say we keep the church out of our government and the government out of our church? And people shouldn't have to believe in Christianity if they don't want to. I know, the guy was downright un-American. So Williams moved south to Narragansett Bay, where he befriended some of the local natives, and he would remain on good terms with them for the rest of his life. He and his friends called their plantation, which was just another word for colony or settlement at the time, Providence, because they believed it was God's providence that had brought them there. Fun fact, Williams also named one of his 6 children Providence, probably giving the other 5 mental health issues. When several other ministers and their flocks were also exiled from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, people like John Clark and Anne Hutchinson, who committed the grave sin of preaching while female, Williams helped them to purchase Aquidneck Island from his Native American friends. That island had been established on European maps as Rhode Island, or the Island of Rhodes. Again, you can read about it here. Soon, 2 more towns were established on that island, Portsmouth in the north and Newport in the south. Thus, we have Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. Rhode Islanders are proud of their founder, as well they should be. Roger Williams is famous for establishing some of the freedoms that Americans hold dear to this day, including separation of church and state and freedom of conscience. He also encouraged Rhode Islanders to pass a law in 1652 that outlawed slavery. Sort of. See, the Puritans drew a distinction between people who were enslaved because they were on the losing side of a war, which was seen as just and proper, and the outright kidnapping and enslavement of African natives, which they found offensive. The 1652 law banned the enslavement of Africans and limited any enslavement or indentured servitude in the colony to 10 years. But eventually even that law was fully ignored once the local merchants became enamored with all the money they could make trafficking slaves. In fact, the city of Newport was possibly the most prolific slave trading point on the famous Atlantic Triangle trade that saw slaves from West Africa, sugar from the Caribbean, and rum from the colonies move around the ocean like so many semi-trucks on an interstate highway. According to Brown University, about 60%, and in some years 90%, of the slave trading vessels launched from North America originated in Rhode Island, most in Newport. At one point, Newport alone had 22 rum distilleries. So while Rhode Island wasn't necessarily famous for its plantations, it was definitely famous for its slave trade. So let's fast forward to 2020, when almost no one outside of the state paid any attention to the fact that Rhode Island was trying to change its name. We kind of had other things on our minds. Sorry, Rhode Island. But maybe that's a good thing, because it allowed Rhode Islanders to decide for themselves, without too many accusations of political correctness or cancel culture from those of us outside its borders, whether they wanted to change the name. These debate lines had been drawn back in 2010 when this question went on the ballot for the first time. 10 years ago, the measure failed by a big margin, almost 78%. Supporters of the change were accused of trying to rewrite history or trying to change the past. because the primary issue in both the 2010 campaign and then again in 2020 was that word, plantations. Not what it meant when it was used to name the colony, but what it means today. And today, that history is all tied up with the enslavement of millions of African Americans and their descendants. So the question for Rhode Islanders was whether or not to erase from their name that hint of slavery that stains this country's past like red wine on a white blouse. And they did. By a small majority, 52.9%, the state's residents voted to change the name.
By the way, I've been examining my own mind and conscience, and I think I voted no 10 years ago. I know I'm voting, I think I'm voting yes this time around because I'm not,
Right on.
it's just time. It's just time.
What a difference 10 years makes, huh? And these 10 years in particular were crammed full of news stories about institutional racism, police killings of unarmed Black people like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and the rise of Black Lives Matter.
Were very fine people on both sides.
I think it's fair to say that public perception has changed somewhat since 10 years ago. But let's get to the most important question about the name change. What do I think? Because I've never been to Rhode Island. I grew up in Texas, moved to California, and have spent the last almost 30 years in Colorado. I think the number of times I've traveled to a state east of the Mississippi River is in the single digits. But I did write this book, and I'm an old lady with an opinion, what can I say? I think changing the name was the right decision, and I think that for two main reasons. First, because the word is offensive to a large population of people in this country, including people in Rhode Island. I think keeping the word plantations in the name is like asking a Jewish person to live in a state called Texas and Houston concentration camps, or asking Japanese people to live in Utah and Provo internment facilities. Those words all have other meanings, but they are still a source of stinging historical pain to certain communities. Supporters of the change included prominent African American Rhode Islanders, and I think their opinions matter most, even more than mine.
You know, what the meaning of plantation does to others has also evolved. Yes, it was about farms and colonies, but you also have to think, who worked those farms and how and why were they working them?
And I think people recognize that we have to change that name because for some people, that's our history. But they forget that our history also included slavery.
I have certificates and awards that say Providence Plantation. That don't even hang up because of the word plantations on it, right? Because that affects me. It affects the soul and the essence of me as a Black person.
One Portsmouth author named Brian Stinson worked hard against the name change, publishing an op-ed in several newspapers that read in part, "Will this November election be the first time voters anywhere change history?" Now, I'm not trying to pick on Mr. Stinson. He seems like a pretty good guy. He even speaks proudly of having attended a speech by Martin Luther King Jr. in his youth. And he describes himself as a wannabe historian, which is exactly how I describe myself. But that question is just silly. No one is trying to rewrite history or change the past. The whole point of the change is to acknowledge history, to recognize the offenses of the past and make changes accordingly. Roger Williams will always have been a visionary founder of Rhode Island. No one is blaming him for slavery, or even for naming his colony with a word that would become painful to so many so long after his death. And the state capital is still named Providence. Mr. Stinson also wrote, "Rhode Island's Black history and heritage is something to be proud of." And that is simply not true. Like most states, Rhode Island's Black history and heritage is, at best, complicated. Yes, they disapproved of enslaving Africans in 1652, but also, Newport will always have been a busy slave trading center. Now, I understand Mr. Stinson's urge toward historical purity, but I also believe that history is told from different perspectives, and one person's purity is another person's pain. But finally, my second reason for approving of the name change has nothing to do with slavery or history, but rather with practicality. And that is that nobody calls it Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. Trevor Noah and many other Americans didn't even know the second half of the name existed. The state doesn't even put the full name on people's driver's licenses. Even historically, the name of the colony and state was often shortened. Here's a letter addressed to Rhode Island by an American you might have heard of named George Washington. One Providence resident put it perfectly. In a Boston Globe article, Damona Delgado was quoted saying that the only reason people use the full name is when noting that it is the smallest state with the longest name, and that, quote, if that's our only point of pride, then we need something else to be proud of. I personally think Rhode Island has plenty to be proud of.